just society would simply consist on the meritocratic competition of the ladder to success. That idea actually is not an alternative to inequality. If you think about it, it's a justification for inequality.
So the farm was my escape to be with animals, for them to treat me like I was nothing, to tell me that I was but one dot in the larger scheme of life.
Pakistan's history has evolved. There were very specific limitations and circumstances that in which one thing led to another. And that's how I read it or choose to read it.
We're absolutely delighted to be able to present a new season of JLF at New York in association with Asia Society, New York. We have lined up for you some wonderful ideas and themes and speakers, and I do hope that these will fire your imagination, your mind.
On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, Sanjoy Roy, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, we welcome you to the third session of JLF New York 2021 Virtual Edition. Presenting the Fortune Men, Nadifa Mohamed in conversation with Abeer Hoque. Writer Nadifa Mohamed's book, The Fortune Men, shortlisted for the Booker Prize 2021, is an unsettling account of post-colonial prejudice, injustice, and the fight for dignity, based on the real events surrounding the imprisonment and execution of a Somali man in Cardiff in the 1950s. Her vivid narrative style humanizes the accused's aspirations and vulnerabilities and observes the process of his belief in the British justice system slowly fade and be replaced by spiritual contemplation and urgency. Brutal and equally compassionate, the compelling novel shines an essential light into a neglected period of British history. In conversation today with writer Abeer Hoque, Mohamed explores the nuances of bringing this haunting tale to life and gives us a glimpse into her writing process. Nadifa was born in 1981 in Hargeisa, Somaliland. At the age of 4, she moved with her family to London. She's the author of Black Mamba Boy, The Orchard of Lost Souls, and most recently, The Fortune Men, which is, as we said, shortlisted for the 2021 Booker Prize. She's received both the Betty Trask Award and the Somerset Maugham Award, as well as numerous other prize nominations for her fiction. She was named as one of Granta's Best of Young British Novelists in 2013. She contributes regularly to The Guardian and the BBC. Abeer Hoque is a Nigerian-born Bangladeshi-American writer and photographer. She's the author of a monograph of travel photography and poems, The Long Way Home, a linked collection of stories, photographs, and poems, The Lovers and the Leavers, and a memoir, Olive Witch. Please do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. JLF New York 2021 has been brought to you for free without charging a registration fee. It has not been easy for us to do this. We'd love your support. Please do support us as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. Simply click on the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your contribution will be greatly appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, the Fortune Men, Nadifa Mohamed in conversation with Abeer Hoque. Over to you, Abeer.
Thank you, Rupa. Nadifa, I'm so thrilled to speak to you again at the Jaipur Lit Fest New York edition. I'll briefly tell our viewers, Nadifa and I met in 2018 at Diggi Palace, an actual palace in Jaipur, India, as part of a panel of African writers, including the wonderful Chika Onigwe and Abubakar Adam Ibrahim of Nigeria. So the Zoom setting is a bit of a far cry from that, and I'm terribly sorry we can't meet in person in New York to have this conversation. But I also have to say how excited I am. Yeah, Thank you. You too. I also have to say how excited I am that your third novel, The Fortune Man, has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize. The novel is not even out here yet, so I feel very lucky and special to have scored a PDF copy for this event. So thank you for that. I remember you posting a couple of years ago about visiting the port city of Cardiff, and I think you were checking shipping logs and other archives for your book. But I think this has been a much longer journey for you. Can you tell us more about how The Fortune Man came to be? I know the protagonist, Mahmoud Matan, is a friend of your father's. What got you from hearing the stories and reading the papers to wanting to write a novel?
It was a long and convoluted process, Abeer, and you're right, it has been much longer than 2 years. So I first found out about Mahmoud's case in 2004 in a newspaper, British newspaper, and it was a quite schlocky account of what had happened to him in the 1950s. And I was really shocked. I didn't know much about the Somali presence in the UK at all. And I wanted to know, why was this man in Britain in the first place? And why did this happen to him? And it's a fascinating case. I think anyone who hears about it never forgets it. That's something I've realized a lot of people are quite fixated on this case. So I always would check in. I found out quickly that my father had known him. They were both sailors who'd arrived in the UK in 1947. They'd lived briefly together in Hull before Mahmoud went back to Cardiff with his wife, or following his wife, and my father had gone to sea. My father spent most of his time at sea and was away when all of this happened. He came back after Mahmoud's execution. So I was always fascinated and would keep up to date with whatever information had come out. And thanks to another researcher, Chris Phillips, the archives were opened early. Normally there's a 70-year wait after someone's death, but he managed to get them released under a Freedom of Information request. And that's what really, I think, allowed me to get under the skin, get beyond the newspaper reports of what had happened. And I think once I'd read the archives, the case notes, the trial transcripts, I thought, yeah, there's no way I can't do something with this. It's too important.
Wow. I didn't know that detail about 70 years after someone's died that information is released. You've spoken about your love for the collaborative nature of semi-autobiographical work. And I love this idea of the writer communing with the past through archives, research, travel, and interviews. Can you talk more about that collaboration, what it means to write a fictional book about a real person?
Well, for me, that was my primary experience of writing. I didn't study creative writing. I didn't really know I was trying to write a novel, but it just came about through this ad hoc process of talking to people, talking to my father in particular, because my first novel was about my father. And it coming out of all of the things I needed to do. So the things that I needed to find out, the places that I needed to go, the people that I needed to meet. That's, I think, the work is almost a secondary creation after I've done this work, which is a much more personal need. But when I try and put it in context, as someone who's written 3 novels, I can see how I've always been obsessed with history. The writers that excite me are people like Claude Mackay and Zora Neale Hurston, who were straddling this position between anthropology, activism, fiction, poetry, and living lives that allowed them to meet with a real broad range of humanity and to tell the stories that are otherwise excluded. I think if I have a kind of mission statement now, it's probably, yes, to tell the stories of those who are otherwise cut out of history.
Right. I think that one of your goals was to tell Mahmoud Matan's human story and not the shocking headlines about an illiterate petty thief who lies and cheats and is an easy target for the police to accuse of murder.
Yeah, which dehumanizes him as well.
Exactly, the person behind the spectacle, the loving father, the beloved husband, the charming, adventurous polyglot, the style hound, and the young man who the British justice system fatally fails. And he is so terribly young. It's hard and tragic to remember that he's only 28 when he's executed by the British government.
And maybe even 4 years younger, because he might have added years to his age to join the Merchant Navy.
Right, yeah. which is even more astonishing because his travels, when he leaves home, he's only 14, by this account anyway.
Yes, yeah.
I'm reminded of two things here. One is how the anti-Black racism is yet still such a profound factor in both our countries' justice systems. And secondly, the power of literature to humanize the dehumanized and perhaps change how people see each other, and maybe even change the world. Did you think along those lines? How did it feel both in the writing and afterwards?
I think I was feeling, while writing The Fortune Men, I was very conscious of the way that anti-Black racism manifests, even in my life, when you walk down the street and you see people clutching their handbags because you're near them. That's such a disorientating and disturbing reality. And it doesn't matter. The interesting thing is it doesn't matter who you are. So people often say, oh, but does it happen to you? And it's like, of course it happens to me, because it's a racial thing. It's not, you don't opt out of it. You can't opt out of it. And Mahmoud had those exact same experiences, I'm guessing, but also I do believe, in the 1950s. So it felt like a very contemporary story. I felt like I could identify with much of what was grating against him. He seems like a man on edge. In the last year or 18 months of his life, he was quite different to the way he had been. He started committing petty crimes. He was a bit abrasive. He had cut himself off from the Somali community and alienated the Muslims by stealing money from the mosque. But I wanted to know, well, why? What's going on? And I can see how that general humiliation, that daily microaggression that happens, does change you. And it makes you paranoid, and it makes you angry, and it makes you despairing. And it makes you want to become the thing that they fear already. So that's what I was trying to work out with Mahmoud, trying to speak with him, trying to understand, okay, am I imagining this, or is this what it was like for you? And you can get, he spoke a lot. He was a very verbal young man, and, he's constantly being very blunt with the police. He says that they're liars. He says that they want to pin everything on a black man, that they'll execute him, whatever the truth is. And to them, to the Welsh jury and to the people around him, that's all cheeky. It's all unacceptable behaviour, and also unfair. And that mentality that Britain is a fair place, it's a land of fair play. But he knows that's not the reality. And that kind of, who is mad here? The person who's saying it how he sees it, or the people that refuse to accept his subjective experience? And can those two realities ever make sense with each other?
I think it's that sense of audacity that it seems like he's being punished for. The yes. idea that he could speak back, that he can even consider himself an equal to his former colonizers. That feels
yes,
like,
for sure. Because other Somalis committed murders of white people, of other Somalis, and not one of them hanged. They all were they were found guilty and then generally sent to Broadmoor, which is a psychiatric prison, and then deported. So after 18 months, they'd be sent back to Somaliland. So a very light punishment in comparison, while Mahmoud had very flimsy evidence against him, but was hanged. And it's because of who he was and how he spoke and the threat that I think he posed to that social order.
Yeah, and thinking about also, when my family left Nigeria in the 1980s, I spent my teenage years in the former steel town of Pittsburgh. And I vividly remember its sluggish rivers, these rusted factories. Some were still belching smoke and fire into the sky. And the neighborhoods, we would actually hold our breath out to drive through because they smelled so strongly of chemicals. And this is the setting for part of my memoir, All of Which. And so there's no wonder that your industrial descriptions of Cardiff really resonated hard with me. If you'll allow me to read this fabulous sentence. He enjoys watching the nightly industrial spectacle, the dirty seawater appearing to catch fire as vats of rippled white-hot furnace slag from the Eastmoor steelworks tip into the lapping evening tide. I mean, the sea is almost on fire in this scene. It kind of feels like the world building that writers do for sci-fi or fantasy. How did you conjure up 1950s Cardiff?
Well, there's a great bunch of material written by people who lived in Cardiff in the 50s, 60s and beyond. Local historians such as Neil Sinclair. There's a lovely book of poetry and drawings by Harry Shipmate Cook, whose poem I use at the beginning of the novel. So Tiger Bay has its own local historians and myth makers. So it was really easy for me to imagine what it was like. And I think what really brings it to life is not so much the pictures or the newsreels, but things like poetry and the little stories that people tell. So I remember Neil Sinclair talking about the Mahmoud Matan case, and people referring to fortune tellers to try and work out the truth, and dreams and almost the occult. I think that's a part of the city, the neighborhood, that you wouldn't know unless someone local told you about. That's how people behaved and acted. And it's very much, there was another story about a Jewish woman married to a Somali sailor who saw 2 cracks of lightning in the air and realized that her husband had died at sea. And then the next day, a telegram arrived confirming that reality. Wow. And that's also something that my father spoke about with his mother in Somaliland in Eritrea, that she would go and consult fortune tellers to work out if he was safe at sea. So it was both very familiar, but also very different to the everyday life that I live. And I think that texture, and also it was a very female thing, this belief in signs and almost magic. I think that was a feminine aspect of Tiger Bay that I didn't know about before.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's also part of how sailing life was, where you did sort of look into the idea of auguries or
Yes.
prophecies. Yeah,
because you never knew. And during the Second World War, a quarter of the sailors of Tiger Bay died during the Second World War, a quarter. So the Merchant Navy had the highest death rate out of all of the different forces.
Wow.
Many men did not return home.
I also remember this lovely detail that stuck out for me in the beginning of the book. Violet, the Jewish shopkeeper whose murder is at the center of Mahmoud's downfall, saves magazines, including the American magazine Good Housekeeping. And I remember my Bangladeshi mother, who'd never been to America, getting a subscription to Good Housekeeping when we lived in Nigeria in the 70s and 80s, and I would read them front to back, often in uncomprehending fascination.
Yes. And it's, again, a weird way that the 1950s are so familiar is that when I looked at the Welsh newspapers from that time, there's often yoga, discussions about yoga in these local papers, and that celebrity culture is really gripping, taking hold of society at that time. So there's lots of Hollywood actors. Charlton Heston is in Cardiff to do this or that, or people are very pleased with the success of Shirley Bassey in London. So yes, that media landscape and Mahmoud's fascination with film and cinema, these were all aspects that I think took it away from being an obvious period story to being something that, I could associate with my own life. I could relate to.
Right. I'm thinking also about your characters. You spend some time in the book talking about Violet, and then also Diana, and they become full-fledged rich actors with their own inner lives. And you do that with Berlin as well. And then there's minor characters like Tahir, the sailor who goes mad with electroshock therapy. And then I don't know how to say his name, Tayayake, the Mohawk from Canada.
Tayayake.
Yeah, and from whom we hear the hateful history of zoos and human zoos in Europe. What was it like kind of creating this multi-international cast of characters?
Oh, I loved it. This was the book that really allowed me to go there, because I've always, with Black Mamba Boy as well, because my father was going from country to country, you got a sense of that. But he was also moving quickly, while here you have these people who are generally stationary, but have this whole world behind them that they're connected to. So Tayage is based on a real Mohawk friend of mine who I met in Peru at a book festival. And he told me, I was talking about my novel and about the human zoos in there, and he said, oh yes, Mohawks were also a key part of that, as well as other indigenous groups around the world. And I also, Tahir was a real person in Cardiff, and he was the one that the police were probably looking for. And 2 years after Mahmoud was executed, Tahir did kill someone. He, I think, had a psychotic break and ended up killing a man on a country lane. And it was a very different kind of murder, and that's what makes me think he wasn't the killer in the 1952 case, but he did go on to kill. Berlin, I fell in love with.
He's an amazing character.
Father knew of, and I think he's my favorite. And I found out more and more about him. So he went from being a small character to just becoming more and more important, because I met his son. His son still lives in Tiger Bay, and he didn't grow up with his father. His son grew up in Somaliland, but then came as an adult to work as a sailor here. And yeah, he also experienced life in a human zoo, and that's what brought him to Europe, Berlin, not the son. So these characters are just so big. They're so romantic in a way.
They are.
That I couldn't keep them out. Yeah, they are.
Yeah, I could read a whole book about Berlin.
Of someone. Pardon?
I'm sorry. I said I could read a whole book about Berlin.
Me too. Maybe I'll write that. But with Tahir, you have a very tragic case. And then with Berlin, you have someone who somehow, despite that very worrying beginning, he makes it work. He lives a stable life, a happy life, and dies comfortably and is buried in Cardiff.
Yeah, and I also wanted to talk about Matan's mother, who is also such a beautiful and tragic figure in his life. And I love this phrase you used, her albatross love. So it keeps pulling at him, pulling him down, or but also
back.
Thing that just stays with him no matter what. He hears her voice often.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I've got this returning thing about these mums, and I guess maybe it's to do with my own grandmother and her relationship to my father, because they had a very elastic connection. She was often absent, but then when he needed her, she'd swoop in and fix things, and they were very close. And she was a single mum, so she was the main formative person in my father's life. And all of these Somali older mums, you know, the generation beyond my parents who were nomadic, you know, many of them didn't live in a cash economy. The cash economy hit them hard, and they had to go find work because the very old traditional life of trading and bartering just couldn't operate in a colonial system anymore. It wasn't enough. So they're so ancient in a way, and that love, you know, when you lose 10 children out of 15, what kind of way do you raise the 5 that remain? It's probably with so much passion and obsession and almost violence. You know, the way that generation treated medicine, it was often about burning you, cutting you, shoving something inside your mouth or wherever it might go. It was a way of like almost sort of saying, if you want to live, you better show it.
Right.
And we'll use pain to make you show it.
Prove
because
it.
Too many children have already gone. Yes.
Yeah.
So then, of course, and I think at one point that Mahmoud, the last thing that she did to him was cut him and then put salt in the wounds.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
Yeah. So that's enough to make him get up on his feet and walk and stay away from her. And that very complicated attachment that they have, which is love. You know, there is love, but there's also fear, and there's also maybe revulsion to a certain extent, because they are the person that causes you pain. But when he's desperate and has no one else, she becomes the person that he wants to come and save him.
Right. There's almost it feels like an interlude where he ends up in with the Somali widow when he's just a child still. It
in
feels
Dar
like
es Salaam.
Kind of, in Dar es Salaam, yeah. It feels almost dreamy, like it's sort of like a summer away or something. It was such a lovely interlude in the book to read that bit.
Yes, and that past all of those bits about his earlier life are more fictionalized, because I only had very bare facts about his earlier life. He told the prison doctor a bit of his biography, and it was, I'm the youngest of 4 boys or 5 boys. My parents had a shop and some, you know, I did in northern Rhodesia for not having a passport. So but though from those bare bones, I had fun with it. And I took him to Tanzania because I thought, okay, well, where would he have learned Swahili? And I wanted myself, I hadn't been to Zanzibar, so I took him to Zanzibar as a way of imagining myself there. I took him to Dar es Salaam. And yeah, I wanted to play. I wanted to give him some time to play as a young person before life got so serious.
It feels like that, yeah. And we still also get to know him also, like, you know, the interaction he has, or the infatuation he has with the girl who comes to the widow's home.
The laundry girl.
And we kind of understand how some of his ideas about women and relationships and how, you know, structures function in his society.
Yes, hugely formative. That's the first time away from parental supervision, and you know, he's in strange places with strange people, and he's not harmed, which I guess also then makes you realize why he had that false sense of security in Cardiff, because he'd been to so many places and had been fine, and people had looked after him. But that wasn't the case in Britain.
Right. I'm thinking about your litanies. Yours are pure joy to read. You have so many of them scattered throughout the book. Just a list of ways, and they're so evocative and visceral. They create an atmosphere and a setting for the story. And I was wondering if you might want to read a little bit from any section. It doesn't have to be one of those, but
Sure. Yeah. 1 second. I'll read one of those litanies. The streets are quiet, but the news of the king's death drifts from many of the low-slung, wind-blown terraces he passes. Each wireless set relaying the broadcast discordantly, either a second ahead or delayed. Passing the shops on Bute Street, he finds a few lights still on. At Susson's pawnbrokers, where many of his clothes are on hock. At the Cypriot barbershop, where he has his hair trimmed. And at Valaki's, where he used to buy seafaring kits, but now just bags the occasional dress for Laura. The tall, grand windows of Corey's Rest are steamed up, with figures laughing and dancing behind the leaded glass. He peeks his head through the door to check if some of his regulars are there, but the West Indian faces around the snooker table are unfamiliar. He had once belonged to this army of workers, pulled in from all over the world, dredged in to replace the thousands of mariners lost in the war. Dockers, tallymen, kickers, stevedores, winchmen, hatchmen, samplers, grain porters, timber porters, tacklemen, yardmasters, teamers, dock watchmen, needlemen, ferrymen, shunters, pilots, tugboatmen, foyboatmen, freshwatermen, blacksmiths, jetty clerks, warehousemen, measurers, weighers, dredgermen, lumpers, launchmen, lightermen, crane drivers, coal trimmers, and his own battalion, the stokers. Mahmoud turns away from the wreathed and porticoed splendor of Corey's Rest towards the docks, from where a red mist tints the raw, uncooked sky. He enjoys watching the nightly industrial spectacle, the dirty seawater appearing to catch fire as vats of rippled, white-hot furnace slag from the East Moor steelworks tip into the lapping evening tide. The railway on the foreshore bank clanking and screeching as carts shoot back and forth between the billowing steelwork chimneys and the angry steaming sea. It's an eerie and bewitching sight that catches his breath every time. He half expects an island or volcano to spit out from the bubbling, hissing stretch of petrol-streaked water, but it always cools and returns to its morose, dark uniformity by morning.
Love that. I highlighted so much of that entire section that you just read. And that list of, all the people who are working in the docks and in the ships. It's incredible. And I love this line, the red mist tints the raw, uncooked sky. I adore your writing.
Thank you.
There's a beautiful line in the book where Mahmoud is speaking to Violet in his head. And he says, the thread of my life will be cut the moment you die. And this idea of fate or a destiny prefigured before you're even born is part of many religions, including Islam. But far from trapping him, the idea almost calms him, as does his growing spiritual understanding. Can you talk more about how the themes of religion and fate interweave in your work and in the
Sure.
Somali.
Somali culture is very steeped in Islam. It's quite common when someone dies to talk about their fate and notice the fact that their fate took them there, or it was their fate calling them there, almost like a siren, and it being unavoidable. What can you do? You know, you can try medicine, you can try whatever, but if it's your fate, then it's unavoidable. And I think there is comfort in that, because I think in modern cultures, Western cultures, there's this feeling that you should be able to stop everything bad happening, and that you are the master of your own destiny. And if you fail at that, then it's your fault, it's your problem, rather than it being beyond your control. And that makes us always, I think, feel pressured and anxious about threats that are possibly, that we should be anticipating and dealing with, and this feeling that we're alone, besieged by potential threats. And when Mahmoud feels comforted by the idea of fate bringing him here, I don't know how long it might last, but it does give him some sort of balm at that point where he's a fighter. He's someone who's used to butting his head against an obstacle. But when he realizes that he doesn't need to, and this is beyond him, there's something freeing about that. And there's something, even if God in his last letter that he dictated in prison, he says, may God let me go, may God give me my freedom back. But he knows that might not happen, but there's still no anger at God, which I think is really profound, because I would feel anger. I know I'd feel anger at being framed for a crime I did not commit and losing my life because of that framing. And I guess if you're days away from death, weeks away from death, you don't want to spend it in just anger. And Mahmoud hadn't lived a religious life at all, pretty much, from the looks of it. But that programming, that very early programming from his mom, from the Islamic school he would have gone to, from this very quiet religious world in Hargeisa, the city, the town, it was just a small town at the time that he'd come from, all of that would be activated, I think.
Yeah. And we see him kind of swinging between these, these furious rages, and also just being out of control, to kind of coming back, calm, to contain himself and be the person that he wants his wife to remember and his sons to remember.
Yes. Yeah, and it also made me think about all of the people who turn to Islam in prisons right now, and the way that they're perceived as being radicalized, while instead having 5 prayers a day allows you to structure this otherwise very free time that will make you go mad, It gives you a bunch of rules that are your own and not the prison's rules. It gives you a sense of identity. All of these things that allow you to maintain your humanity a bit more. And I think that was true for Mahmoud in the 50s as it would be for someone in jail right now.
Right. I read on Wikipedia that your next book is about Somali women in modern day London. I'm curious if you'll have the same sense of collaboration that we talked about earlier, or if the contemporary time frame and current geography will feel freeing or otherwise, and if you see themes stretching across your books.
Well, I tend to go books about men, books about women, books about men, books about women. So I'm back to my book about women. But I feel I'd like to do one that's less research heavy, and also The Orchard of Lost Souls was less research heavy than the other two. So I think because this is contemporary London and the world that I know, I feel as if I'm probably ingesting all of that information all the time. Right. So you've got your tentacles up. I think as a writer, you'll know this. You're constantly absorbing things, staring at things, overhearing things. And it's that kind of material that I want to use for this novel. There are things I'm researching. One of the characters is a doctor, so I love medicine anyway. It's no chore to learn more about medicine. And another one works in a hotel, so the day-to-day schedule of someone who cleans hotel rooms is fascinating to me. And I'm letting my imagination kind of run and go. I've not written about contemporary Somaliland, so that's something I'd like to do in this novel. All of the things that I haven't quite done yet, it's time to do.
I feel like there will always be that, right? All the things you haven't yet done.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I So do you go to Somaliland often? Is that part of your regular,
Yes.
like one of your
Yeah.
homes?
The last time I went, I don't know if it is one of my homes. It sometimes feels like one of them. The last time I was there was 2019 for the book festival, and I was teaching creative writing there. And generally it's the book festival that takes me back to Somaliland. And the last time I was there, it did feel quite homely, and it was more multicultural than it's ever been. There was people in Hargeisa from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Gulf, Syrians, Iraqis, Ugandans, Kenyans. And that's the sort of, I can't live in a monocultural place and with monocultural food. So the more that Hargeisa changes and becomes a bit more outward looking, the more attractive it becomes to be there for a longer period of time. But it's also still a very strict place, and a place that's quite controlling of women and their behavior and their movement and their dress. And I find that difficult to deal with.
Yeah, I had a similar feeling in Bangladesh as well, where I feel constrained and not able to, I feel like anything that I do that's like remotely kind of other is looked at as really, really out there versus,
Yes.
like what I could be even more of a rebel, but I can't. Right?
You're going easy on them.
Yeah.
No, I agree. And in Somaliland, I think it's even stricter than Bangladesh.
Yeah.
So you'll have men constantly saying, "Oh, sister, your bit of hair is showing here, or your neck is showing, or your wrist is showing." It's too much.
Right. I also love the music that has been a part of some of your work. Can you talk more about the Somali music and how it's a part of Somali culture? Wherever you go.
Yes. So I was friends with Hudaydi, a really wonderful Somali musician, a composer, oud player, a songwriter, singer, amazing, incredible man who sadly died away last year during the COVID pandemic. And he taught me a lot about Somali music and culture and the way that it intersected with the anti-colonial movements, whether that was in Yemen, whether that was in Somaliland, whether that was in Djibouti. And he was part of that. He was detained in Djibouti by the French for composing songs and being part of anti-colonial movements. And the Somali poetry that is a huge part of the culture, and in a pre-literate culture such as Somalia was for most of its history, that's how information was collated and shared and passed on. That was the archive, was in history captured in poetry. So when I was researching the Fortune Men, I wasn't really surprised, but I was a bit surprised to find out that, of course, the sailors also had their own poetry, and they would have these competitions and almost like rap battles between each other, where they would insult each other from Liverpool to London to Cardiff. And you had a group of 8 brothers who came to Britain as sailors, and they were all really fantastic poets. And that combined with a very spare style of music called Garami, which has just got the oud and a drum, and then quite bluesy lyrics often combines for something really powerful and atmospheric.
Right.
So when Mahmoud is in jail, he starts to think back to that music, and it's always about traveling and facing fate and death and all these big issues. It's very much like the blues.
Right. Is it extemporaneous? Are they making up the lyrics on the spot, like the poets?
Often, there are classic ones which are passed on, and that people often add. And that's also the case with, I don't know if you might have seen, but recently a young woman on social media in Somaliland read her own poem about what kind of man she'd like to choose to get married to. And now it's been picked up by something like 20 other poets. So it's like a response, they're each responding, and it becomes this chain of poetry.
Nice, I love that. I'll have to look it up.
It's collaborative. It is collaborative, and that's I can see how I'm also part of that tradition.
Right, and it's
I'm
a storytelling
back.
tradition as well, right? It's an oral storytelling tradition that you're continuing. I see. So I don't know if you would want to read another short section or if you'd.
Okay, 1 second. I'll read from Gloria's, the Diana section. Even at the Slate Tower, music pounds through the walls from the Maltese boarding house next door. Rock and roll with insinuating saxophones and thrusting drums. And Diana bangs her fist against the plaster to make them quiet. An explosion during her time with the WAF in the war has deafened her a little in one ear, but the Maltese play their music loud enough to wake the dead. With her daughter asleep in bed, Diana changes into her nightdress and slips under her quilted silk eider-down. It was Violet's wedding present to her, and for some reason, one particular corner still smells of Ben's cologne. The night always makes the presence of him blur his absence. She draws out his journal from under her pillow and holds the small blue pad carefully to stop loose pages falling out. The lamplight makes the pages look translucent, his fine, even handwriting floating in the air like a chain of dragonflies. She blinks twice and brings the journal closer to make the words still. The entries have stopped reading like the words of a dead man and instead allow her to believe that he is still out there in Egypt, sheltering from sandstorms, wandering through the souks of Suez and Badia for souvenirs to bring home, before the nighttime sorties in the Wellington with his boys in 38 Squadron. She hadn't realized before the war what a beautiful, beautiful writer he was. Even his empty days spent reading whatever books he could get his hands on were written in a way that made her feel the stifling languor of his tent. Now, the deserted Italian positions littered with abandoned trucks, motorcycles, jackboots and binoculars are as familiar to her as the steam-powered fairgrounds of her childhood. The mercury incandescence of the Mediterranean, lit up by a full moon, more worthy of a place in her memory than the turgid Irish Sea.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was so lovely to talk to you, and thank you for writing this book. It was
And you, Abeer.
incredible.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to JLF for hosting us in this conversation.
Thank you, Nadifa, and thank you, Abeer, for an insightful session and for sharing some aspects of your life and stories with all of us. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage all of you to buy the books of our speakers. If you like the session, please do consider supporting us through the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. We sincerely value all your contributions. We thank all our partners for their support. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation and will tune in for the final session of this edition of the festival, A Time Outside This Time, Amitava Kumar in conversation with Sabrina Dhawan. This will be at 1 p.m. Pacific time, which is 2 p.m. Mountain time, and it's 1:30 a.m. Indian Standard Time. Thank you.
I am Tarana, a writer and cultural historian. My book, The Begum and the Dastan, is inspired by true events and oral histories. It narrates the tale of Firoza Begum, who defies her father to attend a savni or a monsoon party hosted by the Nawab. I don't want to give away the story, but she ends up being trapped in the glittering harem of the Nawab of Sherpur. Firoza Begum is one of the women whose voices fall off the pages of history. And here I am standing in the harem of the Qila of Rampur, a richly textured place with its underlying ugliness. The voices of women were never heard, but they existed. The Begum and the Dastan is also about the power of storytelling. Amiruddin Dastan Go, inspired by the story of Firoza Begum, narrates her tale in the bazaars of Sherpur. He mixes reality with the fantasies of his Tilasme Azam. At the end, the Begum and the Dastan ask the question, has anything changed for the women today? The women of small town India, the women of India who have emerged from the zananas and the parda system. But in various small ways, patriarchy still clouds our mind, and maybe mentally we are still in the zananas in some ways. Fittingly, the Begum and the Dastan is going to be published on the 8th of March, International Women's Day. Seated here in the Zanana section, which is now a girls' college, I present a reading of the Begum and the Dastan. This is the part where Firoza Begum attends the court at Benazir Palace and realizes that the man she had insulted is actually the Nawab, and she is terrified. Firoza sat close to the frieze, peering at the hall, resplendent with glittering chandeliers, the turbaned kings, bejeweled in their long jama kurtas, the noblemen and British officers, their smart trousers and red coats with badges and insignia. The musicians were seated at the center on a platform with Munga Jan, glamorous in her red and gold dancing costume, her tinkling feet beating the rhythm. The chobdars, the mace bearers, entered the hall and announced the arrival of the Nawab, reciting his high-sounding title, Amirul Amra, Farzand-e Khas, Daulat-e Inglishiya. Everybody rose from their seats, and the British officers tucked their black hats under their arms. Munga Jan bent double in her salam. Zubaida Begum asked Firoza to get back to her seat. Ammi, no one can see us from outside. Just let me see the Nawab once. The Nawab entered with quick, impatient steps, his head surging ahead of his body, flanked by the British agent and his chief minister. By all standards, he had an unimpressive frame clothed in a cleverly padded, flesh-colored brocade sherwani. The ruby gleaming in his surpage and pearl and diamond strings covered his pigeon chest and created a dazzling aura of royalty. The Nawab turned to talk to his chief minister, the immaculately clipped moustaches quivering with a smile. It was an unremarkable face, imprinted with an arrogance that befitted all the tales of despotism she had heard whispered about him. Bibi, it's him! Tabu clutched her hand and whispered. He knew her. She had insulted the Nawab and identified herself as the daughter of Mia Jan Khan. Stunned, she watched as he sat down on his brocade takht with the swish of his coat and motioned the gathering to take their seats. He was vindictive. Abba often said he never forgot or forgave a rebuff.
A just society would simply consist on the meritocratic competition of the ladder to success. That idea actually is not an alternative to inequality. If you think about it, it's a justification for inequality.
So the farm was my escape to be with animals, for them to treat me like I was nothing, to tell me that I was but one dot in the larger scheme of life.
Pakistan's history has evolved. There were very specific limitations and circumstances that in which one thing led to another. And that's how I read it or choose to read it.
We're absolutely delighted to be able to present a new season of JLF at New York in association with Asia Society, New York. We have lined up for you some wonderful ideas and themes and speakers, and I do hope that these will fire your imagination, your mind.